Hello, and welcome to Anime Audio Commentary. Today I'll be commenting on episode 2 of Cyberpunk Edgerunners. If you'd like to watch along, then start watching now. So last we left off, David decided that rather than sell the Sandevistan, he was going to have it integrated into his body. Which, it doesn't seem like a great idea, when you get down to it. This is military-grade hardware, and seeing as how we saw a guy with something like it, and he went berserk, this doesn't necessarily bode well. And this, doesn't say anything about the cost of having it installed. I guess, fortunately or unfortunately for David, Doc here is willing to install it, but, if David comes crying back to him saying, like, oh boy, this thing wasn't worth it, he gets it for free. So I guess, kind of a win-win for the Doc. Now, I really like the unsettling nature of this scene, because, you can see, like, his spine being removed and replaced. Like, that's incredibly gnarly, and I frankly think it should be. So, just like that, David has presumably his biological spine removed and replaced with his implant, and he's just up and walking again, even though he's basically bleeding through his jacket. Now, I guess it makes sense that, seeing as how he's already had his spine replaced, David's not, he's really not playing around in any regard. Katsuo, I believe that was his name, he's concerned about getting caught fighting because, at Arasaka, it's all about subterfuge and being sneaky. David's kind of beyond that at this point. And, beyond that in more than one sense of the word, seeing as how, I forget whatever the implant was called from the previous episode, this Sandevistan is far and away better than that, to the point where David just sort of, punches this guy across the room as if it were no big thing. And, he does that even as there's still, like, dried blood crusting around where his implant was surgically grafted to him. Now, on the one hand, this was probably satisfying. He punched the guy clean in the face, but on the other hand, this action will surely have repercussions, If what that guy was saying was true and not just a bluff, his father's a big wig executive. Therefore, it goes pretty much without saying that David is going to be expelled at the very least, I don't know much about how law enforcement works in Cyberpunk other than it's probably ineffectual in most cases and incredibly harsh when they do decide to act. But in a situation like this, I feel like they would probably crack down on David. Now, this is interesting, It seems as though the executive here has been given the footage, not necessarily because, his son was punched or anything like that, but it seems like there's a bit of an extenuating circumstance here. Yeah, so, not only is David using a Sandevistan, he's using the Sandevistan that Cyber Psycho from episode 1 used, and he's using it with seemingly no ill effect, despite, well, not being a trained soldier, which seems as though, for one reason or another, David has, I guess, a better tolerance for cyberware. Now, I guess good on that guy's father. Like, he's basically calling his son a big wimp, saying, it's like, oh, you can't handle getting punched in the face once. Good on Tanaka. Even though he's a corpo suit, it seems as though he has, I guess, some semblance of, a reasonable understanding of cause and effect here, Screw around and find out and all that, play stupid games, win a stupid prize. So at this point, David is well and truly expelled. His life is in shambles. He kind of acted impulsively here, got some petty revenge, but ultimately doomed himself as a result. So, if he wants to continue on in life, he's going to have to figure out some alternative to going to school and working in Arasaka. And, in Night City, there's really no shortage of underhanded criminal things you can do, but, David's just a kid. He's going to have to learn pretty darn quickly. And speaking of learning quickly, he might be learning something about the opposite sex, seeing as how this is that girl that was showing up sporadically before. And she seems to be a sort of, I guess a cyberpunk analog to a pickpocket, She's sort of stealing chips out of people. And admittedly, I don't know a whole lot about this and how it relates to sort of like general cyberpunk lore, if everybody has these sort of chip ports embedded in them. But, I'm wondering if maybe David did like the worst possible thing by sort of intervening like this. Oh dear, David, he almost doesn't stand a chance here. So this is something interesting here, in that in Cyberpunk, when you're playing a character, your characters have different classes, and I guess there's sort of like similarities and differences to your standard D&D classes of like fighter, rogue, mage, and all that. Cyberpunk is a bunch of different, I guess, unique classes, and this girl here is what you would call a netrunner. Now, netrunners are interesting in that they sort of have, more so than normal people, embedded cyberware that sort of allows them to peruse the internet. And that's kind of a lame way of explaining it, but like they're basically hackers, but they have, I guess, the extra edge of using their own brain directly. It's probably a rather poor explanation, but it gets the gist across here. But what's really interesting is that as a netrunner, she's just sort of like a petty pickpocket here. I mean, I guess she has the good grace to understand that David with his Sandevistan here is useful. Although, she seemed to be taking more of an interest in the Sandevistan rather than the person attached to it. And I guess to be fair to her, it's not every day you see a military-grade implant on a kid out and about. Nevertheless, David, he's just using it like it's no big deal. I believe we only saw the Lieutenant Colonel use it once before he got zeroed by Max Tac. Which is to say, like the SWAT team came and killed him. So I guess good on David, I guess. He's managing to sort of swim here when his options are sink or swim. On the one hand, he is availing himself admirably by stealing a bunch of chips from people. But on the other hand, I feel like he's not really abiding by rule number 1 of Night City, which is to say, don't trust anyone, I feel like just sort of like immediately teaming up with somebody he's only just met is likely not good. And if that weren't bad enough, it seems like he's suffering some ill effects at the Sandevistan. So this sort of medical orderly, I guess, or ambulance worker, EMT, she brings up that he should be using immunosuppressants. And with my paltry understanding of medicine, that's generally true. If you have like an organ transplant or something like that, you have to take immunosuppressants, otherwise your body will register this, foreign thing as something dangerous and will try to kill it. So I guess it only makes sense that if you have a bunch of silicon and steel bolted into your spine, the human body wouldn't take too kindly to that either. And seeing as how he's not on any immunosuppressants, his body is revolting, for want of a better term. So about that whole, don't trust anyone in Night City, it seems like you can't even trust the EMTs here. The EMT was asking some probing questions about, any family, anything like that, and when it turns out that, no, he doesn't have any family, no, he's not on immunosuppressants, no, he's not really important, and yes, he does have this expensive implant, it seems like the EMT would rather just kill him and steal the thing than actually help him. Now, I kind of feel for David here, because this is certainly a high adrenaline situation, and Lucy certainly looks like she's enjoying herself, if nothing else. The poor guy doesn't stand a chance. And, this is actually interesting. I'm only noticing this now, but they didn't censor the vomit here. And that is something that still rankles with me, that they ended up censoring the vomit in Chainsaw Man. That, if there was one scene they shouldn't have censored, that would have been it. Not like this was as gratuitous as Chainsaw Man, but even so. So now that David is visiting Doc and getting all patched up, we're learning a little interesting thing that David firing up the Sandevistan about half a dozen times is incredibly exceptional. In that, he didn't immediately drop dead. Doc himself said that a grown man could only do it 1 or 2 times. And, this is sort of in line with what we saw the Lieutenant Colonel do. He used it once. It's not like he suffered any ill effects, but nevertheless, he did only use it once. So, whether David's extended use of the Sandevistan is indicative of, I guess, natural talent or just sort of youthful resilience, he's young and therefore this thing can knock him on his butt, but he can get back up. It's interesting that Doc here almost seems to be looking out for him in a weird kind of way, saying, hey, David, you gotta cool it. Use it 2 times, 3 max. If you push it, it's gonna scramble your brain. Even if your body's fine. And Once again, he does bring up cyberpsychosis as a potential issue. And, as I understand the mechanics of the game, that's a bit far-fetched. In the game, there's a stat called humanity, and you subtract bits from humanity every time you install a new upgrade, and only when you cross the threshold of 0 do you actually become a cyber psycho. And I guess, seeing as how it's a generated stat, it differs from person to person. David, it seems to me, would be a person with a pretty darn high humanity stat, so yeah, in the absence of knowing what stats are, it's, understandable that a Sandevistan or something like that could make him a cyber psycho, but, seeing as how it hasn't, we can kind of assume he's got a lot of humanity. So I guess something else that's interesting about this whole interaction is that Lucy, she basically really helped him out here by getting him some immunosuppressants when, he really didn't have the money to pay for it, and his share of the cut wouldn't have done it either. Yeah, man, David really doesn't stand a chance. Lucy's inviting him over to her home, giving him a beer and all that, naturally she's kind of teasing him, and, in his position, he's kind of being a stick in the mud about it. He doesn't like soda, never been to a girl's house and all that. Now, it's interesting that David, by his own admission, he doesn't really drink or smoke. And seeing as how Night City is so corrupt and down and out as it is, I feel like this is almost a rarity of sorts. So this is also interesting. Lucy's bringing up the idea of David becoming an Edgerunner or a Cyberpunk, which are sort of, synonyms essentially for, I guess, mercenaries who do stuff, for want of a better explanation. And I guess David being listless as he is, he might as well become an Edgerunner. So most interestingly, David and Lucy seem to be having a bit of a sincere conversation here, She is really into the moon, and it seems as though the moon's been, I guess, colonized or otherwise somewhat inhabited. David seems to have a grasp of history saying that, people spent a lot of time and money getting that stupid ball of rock in livable condition, but even then, it's nothing really special. But the interesting sincerity is that, Lucy seems to be passionate about it, and she's being kind of open about that. And, there's also this sort of talk about goals and dreams. The big thing here is that David was really going to Arasaka Academy to sort of fulfill his mom's dream of him being successful. He doesn't really have his own goal. And unlike him, Lucy does have a goal, She wants to escape Night City by going as far away as possible, hence, the moon. Wow, this scene really, that really got me the first time, because that little wrapper we see, that's actually a wrapper for a BD, but, it certainly looks like something else. And especially when Lucy says, come here, let me show you something, there's a fair bit of implication there. So as it turns out, what Lucy wanted to show him was this brain dance of the moon and what it's like to be there, you know, feeling the sun pass through the bare atmosphere of the moon, experiencing the low gravity. And, you know, I can understand how that would be kind of cool. And I feel like, you know, those footprints are sort of like a reference to like the original moonwalks and all that. Not like they would necessarily still be there after all this time. You know, whatever little erosion goes around on the moon would probably erode them given enough time. You know, just thinking about it, these brain dances are really rather intricate and interesting, considering that they can pack essentially all this detail that they're witnessing right now with this, I guess you'd call it like a moon buggy or something, driving around on the moon, playing around with vintage spacesuits, checking out craters. And I guess what kind of really makes this scene for me is the music playing in the background. And, you know, it's not really my type of music, but boy, does this song gain significance. You know, it hurts just a little bit. So just to put the icing on the cake, Lucy makes it clear that this is the first time she's told anyone about this sort of dream of hers. And she doesn't really have a reason, but, you know, I guess David sort of came by at the right place at the right time. Man, the poor guy really never stood a chance, did he? So here we go, you know, the first sort of really big twist here. It seems that, you know, there was a buyer for the Sandevistan, and he's rather angry that David has it implanted. And it seems like he's going to take it, whether or not it proves to be fatal. And I guess the worst part of all of this is that Lucy was seemingly complicit. Alright, well that's it for this episode. If you've enjoyed it, then by all means, tune in for the next one. See you, Space Cowboy.